What if the rainforest has been keeping a secret from us? Not for decades, not for centuries, but for thousands upon thousands of years. What if, beneath the canopy where we assumed only chaos and wilderness reigned, there lay something far more unsettling? Order, geometry, intention. What if the jungle, which we have always seen as nature's triumph over human ambition, was actually nature's burial shroud for civilizations that should not, according to everything we've been taught, exist at all? Before we begin this descent together into the green darkness, into the places where light itself seems to hesitate, I want to ask something of you. If you're drawn to the kind of history that doesn't appear in textbooks, the kind that whispers from beneath the earth rather than shouting from monuments, consider leaving a like on this video. Subscribe if you find yourself hungry for stories that unsettle as much as they illuminate. And tell me in the comments below where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a city built on layers of forgotten others? Are you near wilderness that might not be as wild as it seems? I'm curious about the places we inhabit while we think about the places that came before. Now, let us turn our attention to something that happened very recently, and yet reveals something impossibly ancient. In 2018, an aircraft equipped with LiDAR technology flew over the Guatemalan rainforest. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is a scanning system that fires millions of laser pulses at the ground below, measuring the time it takes for each pulse to return. The remarkable thing about LiDAR is that it can see through the canopy. The leaves, the vines, the thick weave of branches that have hidden the jungle floor for millennia. LiDAR passes through all of it as if it were smoke, revealing the bare earth beneath. What those scans revealed in Guatemala should have been impossible. Beneath the emerald weight of the Petén rainforest, the lasers found geometry. They found lines, straight lines, perpendicular lines, lines that intersected at precise angles. They found raised platforms arranged in patterns, causeways extending for miles, the outlines of structures too numerous to count in a single survey. More than 60,000 individual structures emerged from the data, structures that had been there all along, invisible, breathing quietly in the dark beneath the trees. The scans revealed an urban landscape, a complexity of planning and engineering that spoke not of scattered villages or modest settlements, but of cities. Vast cities. Connected cities. Cities that, according to the dates that began to emerge from subsequent archaeological investigation, were thriving when our own historical timelines suggest they shouldn't have existed at all. The conventional narrative tells us that the Maya civilization reached its height during what we call the Classic period, roughly between 250 and 900 CE. We've known about Tikal, about Copan, about Palenque, jewels of Mesoamerican achievement, their temples rising above the jungle like stone prayers to forgotten gods. But what the LiDAR revealed was not merely more of what we already knew. It revealed a scale we had never imagined. The scans showed that these cities were not isolated nodes of culture surrounded by wilderness. They were part of a densely interconnected network, an urban sprawl that covered thousands of square kilometers. Population estimates had to be revised upward, dramatically. Where scholars once thought perhaps 1 or 2 million people inhabited the Maya lowlands at the civilization's peak, the LiDAR data suggested the number might have been 15 million, perhaps more. 15 million people living in cities we couldn't see, hidden beneath a forest we thought was pristine. But here is where the story takes its first turn into unsettling territory. As archaeologists began to excavate the sites identified by the LiDAR scans, as they cut through the jungle overgrowth and began to expose the structures beneath, the dates they found were wrong. Or rather, they were right, but they contradicted what we thought we knew about the timeline of human development in these regions. Carbon dating of organic materials from the deepest levels of some of these structures, thermoluminescence dating of ceramics, stratigraphic analysis of soil layers, all of these techniques began to suggest that the foundations of these cities were far older than the classic Maya period. Some of the engineering works, the massive earthworks and canal systems, appeared to date back not centuries but millennia before the Maya are supposed to have risen to power. Dates emerged that pushed back into the 2nd millennium BCE, into the 3rd, and in some cases, whispers of evidence suggesting human engineering on a monumental scale reaching back even further, into the deep past where our maps of civilization show only blank space. The jungle cities were not merely older than we thought. They implied a continuity of sophisticated urban culture extending back far beyond what our current paradigms allow. They suggested that what we call the Maya civilization might not have been a beginning at all, but a remembering, a restoration of something that had been built long before and then lost, swallowed by the forest, waiting in silence for the day when laser light would finally pierce the canopy and read the geometry still preserved beneath. Consider what such cities require. Not what they signify culturally, not what they mean philosophically. We'll arrive at those questions soon enough, but what they require practically, materially, to exist. Cities do not appear spontaneously. They are not accidents of geography or climate. A city is a statement of surplus. It declares that a society has moved beyond mere survival, that it has organized itself sufficiently to produce more food than immediate consumption demands, more resources than daily necessity requires. A city is possible only when there is infrastructure to support density, when there are systems in place to manage water, waste, agriculture, construction, and the inevitable complexity that arises when thousands upon thousands of human lives intersect in a concentrated space. The LiDAR scans in Guatemala revealed all of this infrastructure, and revealed it at a scale that staggers comprehension. The laser data showed extensive networks of canals, some of them stretching for dozens of kilometers, connecting different urban centers and linking them to agricultural zones. These were not simple irrigation ditches dug by subsistence farmers. They were engineered waterways, some wide enough and deep enough to have served as transportation routes for canoes laden with goods. The precision of their construction, the way they followed contours to maintain consistent gradients for water flow, speaks to a sophisticated understanding of hydraulics. Beneath the jungle floor, the scans revealed reservoirs, massive artificial basins carved into the landscape and lined with clay to prevent seepage. These weren't small community wells. Some of these reservoirs could have held millions of gallons of water, enough to supply large urban populations through dry seasons that might last for months. The placement of these reservoirs showed strategic thinking, an understanding not just of immediate needs but of long-term climate patterns, of drought cycles, of the necessity to plan generations ahead. Perhaps most striking were the terraces. The Maya lowlands are not uniformly flat. The landscape undulates, rises and falls, presents challenges for large-scale agriculture. The people who built these cities transformed their environment to meet their needs. They constructed agricultural terraces on hillsides, creating flat platforms for farming where steep slopes had been before. But the LiDAR data showed something remarkable. In many locations, there were terraces beneath terraces. The scans revealed that the familiar Maya terraces, which we've known about for years, were actually built on top of earlier terracing systems. In some places, archaeologists found evidence of 3, 4, even 5 distinct layers of agricultural engineering, each one buried beneath the next, each one representing a different era of occupation, a different generation's labor, extending back into the mists of time far beyond where our historical models place the beginning of complex society in these regions. Imagine standing on one of those hillsides now, after the archaeologists have cut through the jungle, after they've excavated down through the layers. You would see the stratification clearly, different construction techniques, different ceramic styles associated with each layer, different carbon dates. And you would be forced to confront an uncomfortable question. How long does it take for such layering to occur? How many centuries must pass for a civilization to build, abandon, be forgotten, be buried, and then be built upon again multiple times in succession? The dates coming back from these deep layers suggest that people were engineering their landscape, building permanent structures, organizing themselves into complex societies in the heart of what we call the New World at a time when, according to conventional archaeology, they were supposed to be scattered hunter-gatherers or, at best, early experimenters with agriculture. The timeline doesn't fit. The evidence refuses to conform to the narrative we've constructed about how civilizations emerge, how they develop, how long each stage of cultural evolution is supposed to require. And Guatemala is not an isolated case. It is not an anomaly that can be dismissed or explained away as an exception. Because once you know what to look for, once you understand that LiDAR can reveal what the eye cannot see, once you begin to scan other jungles in other parts of the world, the same impossible geometry begins to emerge everywhere. In the Amazon basin, LiDAR surveys conducted over the past decade have revealed something that contradicts everything we were taught about that vast green wilderness. We were told the Amazon was pristine, untouched, that pre-Columbian populations were small and scattered, living lightly on the land. But the lasers found earthworks, enormous geometric structures, massive ditches and embankments forming circles, squares, and complex combinations of shapes. These structures, called geoglyphs, are vast. Some of the circular earthworks are more than 300 meters in diameter. They are arranged in patterns across hundreds of square kilometers, connected by roads, suggesting a level of coordination and social organization that should not, according to our models, have existed in the Amazon before European contact. And yet the dates from these sites push back well before Columbus, well before the colonial era, back into the deep pre-Columbian past, suggesting that the Amazon rainforest, which we have always imagined as nature's ultimate domain, was actually a managed landscape, perhaps even an engineered one, shaped by human hands for purposes we are only beginning to understand. Move now across the Atlantic to the jungles of Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, everyone knows about Angkor Wat. The temple complex is iconic, a symbol of Khmer civilization's architectural achievement. But Angkor Wat is just the ceremonial heart of something much, much larger. Recent LiDAR surveys of the region around Angkor have revealed that the temple doesn't stand alone in a clearing. It sits at the center of an urban sprawl that extended for more than 1,000 square kilometers. The lasers found city blocks, street grids, neighborhoods, all of it buried beneath the forest that has reclaimed the land since the Khmer Empire's decline in the 15th century. But here's what makes it unsettling. Beneath the medieval Khmer city, the scans are revealing earlier layers. Roads that run at different angles to the Angkor-era streets. Foundation walls that predate the structures above them. Hydraulic systems, canals, and reservoirs that are oriented differently than the ones we attribute to the Khmer, suggesting they served a different urban layout, a different city that existed before the one we know about. Archaeologists excavating these deeper layers are finding ceramics and architectural styles that don't match what we associate with classical Khmer culture. They're finding dates that push back further than the traditional founding of Angkor in the 9th century. They're finding evidence that suggests the forest around Angkor Wat has witnessed not just one great civilization but multiple cycles of urban development, abandonment, and renewal, extending back into a past that our Southeast Asian historical chronologies don't account for. The same pattern emerges in the jungles of Central Africa. LiDAR surveys are still in their infancy there, but initial scans in regions of the Congo Basin and in forested areas of West Africa have begun to reveal what local oral traditions have insisted on for generations. That the jungle is not primordial wilderness but relatively recent overgrowth. That beneath the trees there are stones, structures, the remnants of settlements far older and more extensive than colonial-era explorers ever acknowledged. The archaeology is difficult here. The climate is unforgiving. Organic materials decay rapidly in the heat and humidity. Stone is rare in many of these regions, so structures were often built from wood, mud brick, and other materials that leave few traces after centuries of tropical decomposition. But the earthworks remain. The changes to topography endure. The LiDAR sees the subtle rises and depressions, the geometric patterns etched into the landscape that speak of human intention, of planning, of labor organized on a scale that requires social complexity. What are we to make of this? What does it mean when the same story begins to emerge from rainforests on 3 separate continents, from regions with no historical contact, no known cultural exchange, and yet the evidence speaks the same language? Everywhere we look, once we learn to see through the canopy, we find cities. We find engineering. We find evidence of dense populations managing their landscapes with sophistication. And everywhere we look, the dates are older than they should be. The timelines don't align with our carefully constructed models of how human civilization unfolds. The traditional narrative of human progress is linear and clear. We were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, in a few specific locations around the world, Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Basin, we invented agriculture, and agriculture allowed us to settle down, and settlement allowed us to build villages, and villages grew into towns, and towns into cities, and cities into civilizations. This process, we're told, began around 10 to 12,000 years ago and unfolded gradually over millennia. The rainforest regions were latecomers to this process, if they participated in it at all before European contact. That's the narrative. That's what the textbooks say. But the jungle cities don't fit this narrative. They suggest a different story, one that is far more complex, far more ancient, and far more unsettling. They suggest that the arc of human civilization is not a simple upward climb from simplicity to complexity, from scattered bands to urban centers. They suggest instead that there have been cycles, that complexity has emerged and then been lost, that cities have risen and then been swallowed by the forest, that knowledge has been gained and then forgotten, and that what we think of as the beginning of civilization might actually be just the latest chapter in a much, much longer story. Consider the engineering required to build and maintain these cities in a rainforest environment. Rainforests are not friendly to human habitation on a large scale. The soil is often poor, its nutrients locked up in the vegetation itself rather than available for agriculture. The rains are torrential, causing erosion and flooding. Diseases thrive in the heat and humidity. Insects are relentless. The jungle itself is constantly trying to reclaim any cleared space. Its growth so rapid that an abandoned structure can be completely overgrown within a few decades, invisible within a century. To build a city in such an environment, to sustain it for generations, requires not just determination but profound understanding of hydrology, of soil management, of construction techniques that can withstand both the crushing weight of humidity and the erosive power of seasonal floods. It requires a knowledge base, a technological foundation that takes time to develop. And yet, when we excavate these jungle cities, we often find that knowledge fully formed, already sophisticated, appearing in the archaeological record without the expected centuries of gradual development. We find advanced canal systems without the cruder, earlier versions that should precede them. We find monumental architecture employing techniques that seem to have no local precedent. It's as if the knowledge arrived complete, or was remembered rather than invented. This pattern, sophistication without apparent precedent, is one of the most troubling aspects of the jungle city phenomenon. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, we can trace the development of architecture and engineering over time. We see mud brick structures becoming more complex. We see experimental construction techniques being refined. We see the gradual accumulation of knowledge that eventually produces the great monuments we associate with these civilizations. But in many of the jungle cities, particularly in the oldest layers now being revealed by LiDAR, we see advanced techniques appearing suddenly, as if the builders already knew what they were doing, as if they were working from an existing blueprint rather than inventing as they went. Look at the hydraulic systems in the oldest layers of the Maya cities. They show an understanding of water management that shouldn't exist in a supposedly young civilization. The reservoirs are positioned to collect runoff from multiple directions. The canals are engineered with precise gradients to ensure flow without erosion. Some systems include what appear to be filtration components, layers of sand and gravel designed to clean the water as it moves through the system. These are not the experimental first attempts of people learning to manage water. These are mature technologies, executed with confidence and precision. Or consider the urban planning revealed in the LiDAR data from the Amazon. The geoglyphs and earthworks are not randomly placed. They follow astronomical alignments. They incorporate sophisticated geometric ratios. The distances between structures suggest measurement systems, standardization, a level of coordination that requires not just labor but bureaucracy, record-keeping, perhaps even writing systems we haven't yet discovered. Where did this organizational knowledge come from? How did it develop in a region we believed had no precedent for such complexity? The standard archaeological response to such questions is to suggest that we simply haven't found the earlier developmental stages yet, that they exist somewhere, still hidden, waiting to be discovered. And that's certainly possible. Archaeology is an incomplete science. The vast majority of the world's ancient sites have never been excavated. The rainforests, in particular, are hostile to investigation. Much may still be hidden. But the problem with this explanation is that it requires us to keep pushing the origins of civilization back further and further into the past, each time we find evidence that doesn't fit our existing timeline. And there's a limit to how far back we can push it before we run into an even more fundamental problem: the climate data. 11,700 years ago, the last ice age ended. Before that transition, before the climate stabilized into the relatively warm, wet conditions we call the Holocene, the world was a very different place. Sea levels were lower. coastlines were hundreds of miles from there. Current positions. The rainforests as we know them didn't exist. The Amazon basin was drier, more savanna than jungle in many regions. Southeast Asia was connected to the mainland by land bridges. Central America had different rainfall patterns. The environment that would eventually produce the great rainforests was only just beginning to form. The conventional model of civilization assumes that complex societies arose after this climate stabilization, during the Holocene, once the environment became predictable enough to support agriculture and sedentary living. But what if the jungle cities, at their deepest layers, predate this transition? What if the evidence we're now uncovering points to human societies that were already complex, already urban, before the Ice Age ended? The dates coming from some of these sites are approaching that boundary, that threshold beyond which our entire understanding of human history becomes untenable. And if cities existed before the forests, what happened to them when the forests came? Imagine the transition. As the climate warmed and global rainfall patterns shifted, the places that had been habitable, perhaps even desirable, began to change. The rains came more frequently, more intensely. The vegetation thickened, grew more aggressive. The diseases adapted to the new conditions. The same rivers that had been manageable became unpredictable torrents. It would have been a slow catastrophe, unfolding over generations, perhaps over centuries, as the jungle gradually consumed what humans had built. Those who could leave would have migrated to regions where the climate remained favorable. Those who stayed would have had to adapt, to develop new strategies for living in an increasingly challenging environment, or eventually to abandon their cities to the encroaching forest. Is this why the deepest layers of the jungle cities show such advanced engineering? Were they not learning to live in the jungle but fighting to maintain a way of life that had been established in a different climate, under different conditions? Were they preserving knowledge from an earlier era, an era when these regions were more accessible, less hostile, perhaps even centers of human civilization rather than remote frontiers? The idea seems almost fantastic, and yet it is suggested by the evidence. It is whispered by the dates, by the sophistication appearing where it shouldn't, by the layering of city upon city, each one rebuilt on the ruins of what came before, as if each generation was trying to remember and restore what had been lost. Now, consider the similarities between these jungle cities across continents. There are, of course, differences in architectural style, in ceramic traditions, in the specific forms that culture takes. But the underlying principles, the engineering solutions, show remarkable parallels. Terracing appears in Guatemala, in the Amazon, in Southeast Asia, in Central Africa. Not just terracing as a concept, which might be independently invented anywhere there are slopes and a need for agriculture, but terracing executed with similar attention to water management, similar construction techniques, similar integration into larger hydraulic systems. The canal networks show comparable sophistication regardless of location. The urban planning principles, the way neighborhoods are organized, the way ceremonial centers relate to residential areas, the way cities are connected by causeways and roads, echo across continents. Standard archaeological interpretation attributes these similarities to parallel development, to the idea that humans everywhere will arrive at similar solutions when faced with similar problems. And that's undoubtedly true to some extent. There are only so many ways to build a terrace or dig a canal. But the degree of similarity, the specific technical details that match across vast distances, begins to strain the parallel development explanation. It starts to suggest something else. Contact, perhaps, knowledge transfer, or maybe something even more unsettling. That all of these jungle cities, despite being on different continents, are descended from a common source, an earlier culture that existed before the forests, before the climate transition, when the world was arranged differently and migration routes existed that we can no longer see because they've been drowned by rising seas or swallowed by jungle. The most controversial interpretation, the one that exists at the edges of academic respectability, suggests that what we're seeing in the jungle cities is not the beginning of civilization but the survival of civilization. It suggests that complex urban culture is far older than we think, that it might have achieved remarkable sophistication during the Ice Age, when human populations were concentrated in regions that are now underwater or otherwise inaccessible, and that when the climate changed, the survivors of that earlier world carried their knowledge to new regions, including the areas that would eventually become rainforests. In this interpretation, the Maya, the Khmer, the Amazonian cultures, All of them are not inventing urban civilization but remembering it, reconstructing it, keeping alive a tradition that stretches back not thousands of years but tens of thousands. Is there evidence for such a claim? Direct evidence, artifacts, structures, remains from Ice Age urban centers, is difficult to find because the most likely locations for such centers are now beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water. Sea levels have risen by more than 400 feet since the last glacial maximum. Entire landscapes, vast stretches of coast where humans surely lived and built, are now submerged. We know from recent underwater archaeology off the coast of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean that there are indeed structures on the sea floor, though dating them and understanding their context is extraordinarily challenging. But on land, in the places that remained above water throughout the transition, the evidence is suggestive if not conclusive. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is perhaps the most famous example. The site dates to approximately 9,500 BCE, right at the end of the Ice Age, and features monumental stone architecture. Massive carved pillars arranged in circular enclosures, built by people who, according to conventional models, should have been nomadic hunter-gatherers without the organization or motivation to create such structures. Göbekli Tepe suggests that our assumptions about Ice Age humans are wrong, that they were capable of far more complexity than we've given them credit for. And if they were building monuments in Turkey, what were they building in other regions? Regions that had more favorable climates during the Ice Age, regions that are now harder to investigate because they've been transformed by the forest or the sea. The jungle cities, with their deep layers and their ancient dates, point toward the same unsettling conclusion. They suggest that the story of civilization is not what we've been told. They suggest that we are not the first to build cities, not even close to the first. They suggest that the human capacity for urban organization, for engineering, for transforming landscapes, is much older than our current paradigms allow. And they suggest that the rainforests, which seem so primordial, so timeless in their green immensity, are actually newcomers to the story, that they've spread across lands that once held cities, that the jungle is not the natural state of these places but rather the result of a climate shift that buried an earlier world. Walk with me now through one of these lost cities in your imagination. Not as it exists today, overgrown, partially excavated, mapped by laser but still largely hidden, but as it might have been in its prime whenever that prime occurred. The air is thick with heat and humidity even in the hours before dawn. The sky is beginning to lighten in the east, a pale glow filtering through the haze that hangs over the forest canopy in the distance. But here, in the city, the forest has been pushed back. The plazas are paved with stone, or packed earth, or carefully maintained clay. The structures rise around you, some low and utilitarian, workshops and storage buildings perhaps, others tall and imposing, their facades carved or painted, catching the early light. There is smoke rising from cooking fires. There are voices, though you cannot understand the language. There are people moving about, beginning the day's labor, heading toward the agricultural zones outside the city core, or toward the workshops where crafts are made, or toward the canals where goods are being loaded onto canoes for transport to other cities in the network. There is a sense of routine of an established order. This is not a frontier settlement struggling to survive. This is a mature urban center, confident in its systems, in its ability to feed its population, to manage its water, to maintain its structures, to continue. You walk toward the center of the city, toward the monumental architecture. There are pyramids here, or massive platforms or towers. The specific forms vary by culture, but the impulse toward verticality, toward creating structures that dominate the landscape and reach toward the sky, is universal. These buildings are not simply large. They are precisely aligned. Their orientations correspond to astronomical phenomena. Solstices, equinoxes, the rising points of significant stars or planets. The people who built these structures were watching the sky, recording its movements, embedding cosmic knowledge into the very geometry of their city. Why? Why would people living in the jungle, people whom we imagine as focused on immediate survival, on finding food, avoiding predators, managing the challenges of a tropical environment, why would they invest such tremendous labor in astronomical observation and alignment? The standard archaeological answer is religion. These were temples, we're told, and the alignments were symbolic, meant to honor gods associated with celestial bodies, to mark sacred times in the ritual calendar. And certainly religion played a role. But the precision of the alignments, the mathematical sophistication required to achieve them, suggests that something more than symbolism was at work. These people were measuring the sky because the sky was a timekeeper, a calendar, a way of predicting seasonal changes, of knowing when to plant and when to harvest, of understanding the cycles that govern their world. The monumental architecture was, in a sense, a computer built of stone, a device for tracking and predicting the motions of the heavens. And this knowledge was not simple. The alignments don't just mark the obvious events like the summer solstice. Many of them track far more subtle phenomena, the 18-year lunar cycle, the precession of equinoxes, planetary conjunctions. To observe and record such events requires generations of continuous observation. It requires a stable society, one that maintains its priorities over not just decades but centuries. It requires writing, or at least some system of notation, to preserve the observations so that each generation doesn't have to start from scratch. It requires, in short, all the things we associate with advanced civilization. As you stand in the plaza, surrounded by these structures, you realize that the city around you represents accumulated knowledge. The canals were not designed in a single generation. They were refined over time, each new section learning from the last. The terraces in the hills beyond the city were not planned all at once. They grew, extended, adapted as the population increased and the understanding of the landscape deepened. The astronomical alignments were not lucky guesses. They were the product of patient observation, of records kept and passed down, of a culture that valued continuity and learning. And then, at some point, this all stopped. The city was abandoned. The canals filled with silt. The terraces were overgrown. The plazas, which once rang with voices, fell silent. The forest came back, fast and thorough, erasing the city from view, burying it beneath layers of vegetation and soil until LiDAR lasers found it again thousands of years later. Why did it stop? What happened? The collapse of these jungle cities is as mysterious as their origins. In many cases, we can identify contributing factors. Climate change, not the gradual warming at the end of the Ice Age, but more recent shifts, droughts that lasted for decades, alterations in rainfall patterns that made the hydraulic systems less effective, soil exhaustion, after centuries of intensive agriculture. Even with terracing and careful management, the nutrients in the earth can become depleted, leading to declining crop yields and food shortages. Disease, tropical environments harbor countless pathogens, and a population weakened by malnutrition becomes vulnerable to epidemics that might have been manageable in healthier times. Warfare, competition between cities for diminishing resources can lead to destructive conflicts that drain populations and disrupt the organizational structures that keep a complex society functioning. All of these factors and more likely played roles in the abandonment of the jungle cities. But they don't fully explain the pattern we see, the way these cities seem to fail at roughly similar times across different regions, despite being separated by thousands of miles and having no known contact with each other. The classic Maya collapse occurred around 900 CE. The great cities of the Peton, which had thrived for centuries, were abandoned within a span of a few generations. In Southeast Asia, Angkor was abandoned in the 15th century, though the civilization had been in decline for some time before that. In the Amazon, the massive earthwork complexes seem to have been abandoned even earlier, though dating is less precise there. In Central Africa, the oral traditions speak of great cities falling silent in eras that are difficult to pin to our calendar but which seem to cluster in the same general period, the late first millennium, the early second. Is it coincidence that these widely separated urban cultures all failed within a relatively narrow window of time? Or was there a larger pattern at work, something global that affected all of them? Climate data from this period shows anomalies, shifts in ocean currents, volcanic eruptions that dimmed the sun and cooled the planet for years at a time, changes in the monsoon patterns that govern rainfall in tropical regions. Perhaps these environmental shifts created a cascade of challenges that urban centers, dependent as they are on predictable conditions for agriculture and water management, simply could not overcome. But there's another possibility, one that is rarely discussed in academic literature but which haunts the edges of these investigations. What if the jungle cities failed not because of external pressures but because of something internal, something related to the knowledge itself? What if the accumulated wisdom that allowed these civilizations to thrive, The hydraulic engineering, the astronomical observations, the agricultural techniques became too complex to maintain. Complex systems are fragile. They require constant attention, skilled management, institutional memory. If the institutions that preserve knowledge begin to fail, if the scribes stop training apprentices, if the engineer's skills are not passed to the next generation, the system can collapse with shocking speed. A canal that is not maintained will fill with silt within a few seasons. A reservoir that is not managed will breach its walls during a heavy rain and drain catastrophically. Terraces that are not repaired will erode and become useless. And once the infrastructure begins to fail, the population it supports can no longer be sustained. People leave, seeking opportunities elsewhere, and the city empties. Is this what happened? Did these jungle civilizations become victims of their own success, building systems so complex that they exceeded their ability to maintain them indefinitely? And if so, what does that tell us about our own civilization, which is built on systems of astonishing complexity, systems that require specialists to understand and maintain, systems that most of us take for granted but which might be far more fragile than we imagine? Stand in the ruins now, in your mind, centuries after the abandonment. The forest has returned completely. The stone structures are cracked, their blocks displaced by roots. The plazas are buried under leaves and soil. The canals are invisible, their courses marked only by slight depressions in the terrain that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for them. The terraces are slopes again, their carefully constructed walls having eroded away. Everything that made this place a city is gone, or so it seems. Only the geometry remains, the pattern etched into the landscape, invisible to the eye but there nonetheless, waiting for lasers to find it. And beneath your feet, beneath the soil and the roots and the layers of decay, there are other layers, older ruins, older cities built by people who came before, people who also carved the jungle into submission and also, eventually, were defeated by it. How many cycles? How many times has this happened? How many cities lie buried in the green darkness, one beneath another, each one forgotten until the next civilization arose and, perhaps not even knowing what they were building on, constructed their own city in the same spot, following the same principles, rediscovering the same knowledge. The LiDAR cannot tell us. It sees only the topography, the shapes, the geometry. It cannot explain why the same patterns appear in multiple layers, cannot tell us whether the people who built the upper city knew about the one beneath, whether they deliberately chose to build on sacred ground, or whether they simply recognized, intuitively, that this was a good place for a city, the same recognition that had drawn people to this spot again and again across millennia. Let us turn our attention now to a specific detail, one that appears repeatedly in the archaeological record of these jungle cities and which seems small at first but grows more significant the more you think about it. In multiple sites, across different regions and different time periods, excavations have found evidence of a particular construction technique. Beneath the visible structures, beneath the floors of buildings and the paving of plazas, there are foundations made of crushed stone or gravel, carefully layered and compacted. These foundations serve a practical purpose. They provide drainage, preventing water from pooling under the structures and causing instability. But the interesting thing is the uniformity of the technique. The foundations are constructed using the same principles whether you're looking at a Maya city in Guatemala, an earthwork complex in the Amazon, or a temple platform in Cambodia. The layers are similar thicknesses. The materials are graded by size in the same way, with larger stones at the bottom and finer material toward the top. The compaction methods, inferred from the density of the material, appear to be comparable. This might seem like parallel development. After all, if you're building in a wet environment, drainage is an obvious concern, and layering stones of different sizes is a logical solution. But the degree of similarity is striking. It suggests not just similar problems leading to similar solutions, but similar training, similar knowledge bases. It suggests that the people building these foundations learned the technique from someone who knew it well, who could explain not just what to do but why, who understood the engineering principles involved. And it raises the question, where did that knowledge come from? If these civilizations developed independently, as we're told they did, why do they use the same construction techniques? How did a builder in the Amazon know to use the same foundation method as a builder in Southeast Asia, unless both of them were drawing on a common source of knowledge, unless the technique itself is older than any of the civilizations we're examining, a piece of inherited wisdom passed down from an earlier time? The same question arises when we look at the hydraulic systems. The canals, the reservoirs, the filtration methods, they show a knowledge of fluid dynamics that is not intuitive, not something you figure out through simple trial and error. Water behaves in complex ways. Its flow is affected by viscosity, by the roughness of the channel it moves through, by the shape of bends and junctions, by 100 variables that require careful observation and mathematical understanding to predict and control. The people who designed these systems understood this. They understood that a canal needs a specific gradient to maintain flow without causing erosion. They understood that a reservoir needs overflow channels positioned correctly to prevent catastrophic failure during heavy rains. They understood that silt will accumulate in certain places and designed ways to manage it. This is engineering knowledge, the kind that takes generations to develop and requires both theoretical understanding and practical experience to apply successfully. And yet, in the oldest layers of these cities, this knowledge appears fully formed. We don't find the mistakes, the experimental systems that failed, the learning curve that should precede mastery. We find competent, sophisticated hydraulic engineering from the beginning. It's as if the builders already knew what they were doing, as if they were working from a manual, from a tradition of knowledge that predated their civilization's rise. Where did that manual come from? Who wrote it? Or perhaps the better question is, who wrote it first and how many times has it been copied, translated, adapted, passed from culture to culture as each one rose and fell in turn? Consider also the astronomical knowledge embedded in these cities. The alignments, the sightlines, the way certain structures frame the rising or setting sun or moon at specific times of the year, these are not coincidences. They require precise measurements, long-term observations, and mathematical calculations to achieve. And they appear in jungle cities that, according to our chronologies, should not have had the social stability or the institutional continuity necessary to develop such knowledge. Astronomical observations are a long-term project. You have to watch the sky for decades to understand the cycles fully, for generations to track the slower movements like the precession of equinoxes. You need to keep records, to pass those records down, to maintain an unbroken chain of observers who understand what they're looking at and why it matters. The Maya are famous for their calendar systems, for their ability to calculate dates far into the past and future, for their understanding of cosmic cycles. But where did they learn this? The traditional answer is that they developed it themselves over centuries of observation. But the oldest Maya sites with astronomical alignments don't show a progression from simple to complex. They show complexity from the start. The earliest structures are already precisely aligned. The earliest inscriptions already reference dates using the long count calendar, a system so sophisticated that it can track cycles spanning thousands of years. It's as if the knowledge arrived complete, or as if the Maya were not inventing a calendar but recovering one, remembering a system that had been used before, perhaps by the people who built the cities in the layers beneath their own. And the same pattern holds in Angkor, where the temple complexes are aligned not just to cardinal directions but to specific astronomical phenomena, where the layout of the city itself forms a map of the cosmos, where the proportions of structures encode mathematical relationships that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. The Khmer didn't write extensive astronomical treatises that we know of. They encoded their knowledge in stone, in the architecture itself, and it's a knowledge that seems remarkably advanced for a culture that, according to conventional history, was just emerging from smaller, simpler kingdoms in the early medieval period. Unless, of course, the Khmer were not emerging but re-emerging, unless they were building on foundations both literal and metaphorical that had been laid long before by people whose names we no longer know. There is a concept in archaeology called horizon. A cultural horizon is a period of widespread cultural similarity across a large geographic area, a time when different regions share styles, technologies, and ideas, suggesting connection and communication. Horizons are usually explained by trade, by conquest, by the spread of a dominant culture. But what if there was a horizon we haven't recognized, one that exists at the deepest layers of these jungle cities, one that predates all the cultures we know about? What if the similarities we see, the construction techniques, the hydraulic knowledge, the astronomical sophistication, are not coincidental or parallel developments but evidence of a shared origin, of a knowledge base that was widespread across much of the world during a period we haven't yet brought into focus, a period that ended when the Ice Age ended and the climate shifted and the Old World was buried beneath forests and seas. This is speculation, of course. It's a hypothesis built on fragments, on suggestive evidence rather than conclusive proof. But it's a hypothesis that the jungle cities increasingly support. They suggest a past far richer and more complex than our standard narratives allow. They suggest that civilizations rise and fall not just once but repeatedly, that knowledge is gained and lost and gained again, that the trajectory of human development is not a simple line from primitive to advanced but a cycle, a wave that rises and crashes and rises again. Think about what this means for us, for our own civilization. We live in an age of astonishing technological achievement. We've mapped the genome, split the atom, sent probes to the edge of the solar system, connected the entire planet through a web of digital communication. We assume we're unique in history, that no previous era has achieved what we've achieved, that we are the pinnacle of human development. But the jungle cities whisper a different message. They remind us that complexity is not security. They show us that even sophisticated civilizations, ones with advanced engineering and astronomical knowledge and urban populations in the millions, can fail, can be forgotten, can be swallowed by the earth until only traces remain, invisible until technology allows us to see them again. How much of our own knowledge is actually new, and how much is rediscovery? When we look at ancient structures and find that their proportions match mathematical constants we thought we discovered in the modern era, when we find that their alignments track celestial phenomena with precision comparable to our instruments, when we find evidence of engineering solutions that we've only recently developed ourselves, are we seeing primitive people stumbling onto these things by accident, or are we seeing the remnants of a knowledge tradition that is far older than we? Imagine, one that our own civilization has only recently begun to approach again. The jungle cities don't give us answers. They give us better questions. They force us to confront the gaps in our knowledge, the assumptions we've made about the past based on incomplete evidence. For centuries, we assumed the rainforests were pristine wilderness because we couldn't see the cities beneath the trees. Now we can see them, and each year the LiDAR reveals more, and each excavation produces dates that push the origins of these sites further back in time, and the picture of human history becomes more complicated, more mysterious, more unsettling. There is an idea popular in certain circles that humanity is suffering from amnesia, that we've forgotten something important about our past, that there was a global civilization or at least a widespread network of advanced cultures that was destroyed or drastically reduced by some catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, and that all the civilizations we know about, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, the Maya, the Inca, are not beginnings but continuations, attempts by the survivors and their descendants to rebuild what was lost. This idea is usually dismissed by mainstream archaeology as pseudoscience, as fantasy, as wishful thinking by people who don't want to accept that our ancestors were primitive. But the jungle cities make this idea harder to dismiss. They show us that there were indeed advanced urban cultures far earlier than we thought, in places we didn't expect. They show us that the archaeological record is incomplete, that the vast majority of human history is still hidden from us, either buried beneath sediment and vegetation or lost beneath the waves. They show us that our ancestors were capable of far more than we've given them credit for, that the assumption of linear progress from simple to complex is naive, that human history is messier, more cyclical, more prone to catastrophic loss and painstaking recovery than the textbooks suggest. Imagine you're an archaeologist in the distant future, after our own civilization has fallen. You're excavating what you eventually realize was a major city, though it's been abandoned for so long that the forest has reclaimed it, or the desert has buried it, or the sea has flooded it. You find structures, foundations, walls, the remains of large buildings. You find infrastructure, the ruins of water systems, transportation networks, power grids, all of it corroded and overgrown but still recognizable once you clear away the debris. You find artifacts, devices whose purpose you can only guess at, materials that seem advanced beyond what you assumed your ancestors could produce. And you find layers. Beneath the city you're excavating, there are older cities built on different plans using different techniques. The stratigraphy shows occupations spanning thousands of years, with multiple periods of construction, abandonment, and reconstruction. What would you conclude? If you were honest, if you followed the evidence, you'd have to conclude that the people who lived here were not primitives, that they had knowledge and capabilities comparable to or exceeding your own, and that despite their sophistication, they failed, their civilization collapsed, and everything they built was slowly erased by time and nature until you came along with your tools and methods and revealed it again. You'd have to conclude that civilization is fragile, that no level of technological achievement guarantees survival, that the long-term history of humanity is characterized not by steady progress but by recurring cycles of rise, fluorescence, collapse, and amnesia. This is what we are learning as we excavate the jungle cities, as we send LiDAR pulses through the rainforest canopy and watch as impossible geometries appear on our screens, as we date organic materials from the deepest layers and receive results that contradict our timelines. We are learning that we are not the first to build complexly, not the first to organize millions of people into urban networks, not the first to engineer our environment on a massive scale. We're learning that it's happened before, probably many times, and that each time it ends in silence, in abandonment, in the slow erasure of memory until all that remains are myths and fragments and ruins that don't make sense according to our models of how history works. The jungle cities are speaking to us, but we're only beginning to learn their language. Each LiDAR survey reveals more detail, more structures, more evidence of the scale and sophistication of these lost cultures. Each excavation produces artifacts and data points that complicate the picture, that force us to revise our estimates of population sizes, of technological capabilities, of time depths. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know, how much has been lost, how many stories have vanished into the silence that the jungle provides, that perfect green amnesia that swallows everything and leaves no trace visible from the surface. And yet the geometry persists. The patterns remain. The canals, though filled with soil, still channel water when the rains are heavy enough. The terraces, though overgrown, still shape the slopes. The plazas, though invisible beneath centuries of leaf litter, are still there, harder and flatter than the surrounding earth, waiting to be discovered. The knowledge that created these features is lost, but the features themselves endure, and from them we can begin to reconstruct what was known, what was understood, what was achieved and then forgotten. This is the paradox at the heart of the jungle cities. They should not exist according to our understanding of history, and yet they do exist. They are undeniable. The LiDAR data is objective. The carbon dates are reliable. The structures are real. We can walk among them once the jungle is cleared. We can touch the stones, examine the engineering, marvel at the precision. They force us to choose between our theories and the evidence. And if we're honest, if we're truly committed to understanding the past rather than defending our preconceptions, we have to acknowledge that our theories need revision. We have to accept that human civilization is older, more widespread, more complex, and more cyclical than we've been teaching. What were the names of the people who built these cities? What languages did they speak? What did they believe? What were their daily lives like? Their fears, their hopes, their stories. Most of this is lost to us, probably forever. They left no extensive written records that we can read, no histories, no autobiographies. They left stone and earth, patterns and alignments, the mute testimony of their engineering. They left questions. Did they know they were living in a restoration, that their cities were built on the ruins of earlier ones? Did they have myths about the ancestors who came before, about a golden age when knowledge was greater and the cities were larger? Did they think of themselves as preserving something, maintaining a tradition against the encroachment of chaos and forgetting? Or did they believe they were innovators, that they were building something new, unaware that they were following patterns established long before, patterns that seem to be written into human nature or human memory, patterns that emerge again and again whenever people gather in sufficient numbers and achieve sufficient surplus to build beyond mere survival? We cannot ask them. They're gone. But the jungle cities remain, and they're asking us questions. They're asking us to reconsider what we think we know. They're asking us to look at the green wilderness and see it differently, not as pristine nature but as a graveyard, not as the absence of civilization but as civilization's shroud. They're asking us to think about time on a longer scale, to imagine history not as a few thousand years of recorded events but as tens of thousands of years of forgotten rises and falls, of knowledge gained and lost, of cities built and swallowed, of human ambition repeatedly reaching for permanence and repeatedly failing to achieve it. There's a particular moment in many archaeological excavations that happens when you've been digging for days or weeks, clearing away soil and debris, exposing structures, carefully documenting everything, and then you find something that stops you. An artifact, a feature, something that doesn't fit, that challenges your assumptions about the site, that forces you to rethink everything you've concluded up to that point. For those working in the jungle cities, this moment comes repeatedly. It comes when you carbon date material from what you assumed was a late-period structure and get a result that places it centuries earlier. It comes when you find a sophisticated piece of engineering in a layer that should, according to the stratigraphy, represent an early, relatively primitive occupation. It comes when you realize that the structure you're excavating is built on top of another one, and that one is on top of another, and the deepest one, the oldest, is also the most precisely constructed, the most advanced. These moments of dissonance, when the evidence contradicts expectation, are where real learning happens. They're uncomfortable. They require you to question your methodology, your dating techniques, your interpretation of the stratigraphy. But if the evidence is sound, if the dates are confirmed by multiple methods, if the structures are clearly there and clearly sophisticated, then the discomfort doesn't go away. You have to live with it. You have to accept that your model of the past was wrong, or at least incomplete, and that the truth is stranger and more complex than you imagined. The jungle cities are full of these moments. They're laboratories for humility, places where the earth teaches us how little we actually know. And perhaps that's the most important lesson they offer. Not the specific details of who built them or when or how, but the broader recognition that the past is vast and largely unknown, that human history extends far beyond the documented periods we focus on in school, that there are thousands of generations of people who lived and built and thought and loved and died without leaving any record we can read, but who left their mark nonetheless in the shape of the landscape, in the patterns that persist beneath the jungle, in the knowledge that seems to reappear again and again across cultures that supposedly had no contact. What if memory is not just individual but collective? What if knowledge can be preserved not just in books and databases but in habits, in cultural practices, in the way we instinctively organize space, in the forms that feel right to us when we build even though we can't articulate why? What if the reason similar structures appear in widely separated cultures is not contact or parallel development but something deeper, something genetic or archetypal, a memory encoded in our very being that draws us toward certain solutions, certain forms, certain relationships between earth and sky, between sacred and profane, between center and periphery? These are questions at the edge of current scientific understanding, questions that archaeology alone cannot answer but which require input from neuroscience, from psychology, from genetics, from fields that study not just what humans built but how humans think. The jungle cities are data points in a larger investigation into the nature of human consciousness and human culture. They suggest that we are connected to our ancestors not just through history, which can be forgotten, but through something more fundamental, something that survives even when the cities fall and the forests grow and the names are lost. Stand once more in the plaza of the lost city, in your imagination. It's night now. The air has cooled slightly, though it's still warm, still heavy with moisture. The stars are visible through gaps in the canopy that borders the city, though you're far enough from our own time that the constellations are subtly different, shifted by the slow wobble of Earth's axis. There are fires burning in the city, their light reflecting off the stone facades of the monumental buildings. There are people moving about, though less than during the day. The city is settling into its nighttime rhythm. Someone is singing, a voice carrying across the plaza, the words in a language that exists now only in the stones, in the geometry, in the alignments that point toward stars that still exist but whose names are no longer known. The song is about ancestors, perhaps about the people who came before, about the knowledge they possessed. Or it's about the gods, about the forces that govern the world, about the need to maintain the balance, to keep the waters flowing and the crops growing and the cosmos in its proper order. The singer doesn't know that one day this city will be abandoned, that the plaza will be buried, that the language will be forgotten, that the only trace of this moment will be the carbon in the ash of the fires, carbon that archaeologists will one day extract and date and use to place this moment in their timeline, their attempt to organize the chaos of the past into something comprehensible. The singer doesn't know that the knowledge their people possess, the engineering skills and astronomical understanding and agricultural techniques, will be lost and then rediscovered, lost and rediscovered again, in a cycle that has been repeating for longer than anyone realizes. The singer only knows the song the tradition passed down through generations, the story that must be told to preserve the memory, to keep the knowledge alive. And in singing, in performing this ritual of remembrance, the singer is participating in something larger than any individual civilization, larger than any empire or culture. The singer is part of humanity's long struggle against forgetting, against the entropy that claims everything, against the silence that waits at the end of all things. The LiDAR technology that revealed the jungle cities is itself a kind of memory recovery device. It looks through the obscuring layers, the trees, the undergrowth, the soil, and recovers the patterns beneath, the traces of human activity that time has tried to erase. In this sense, archaeology is always an act of remembrance, an attempt to bring back what has been lost, to give voice to the voiceless, to make visible the invisible. And what we're remembering now, through the LiDAR scans and the excavations they guide, is that human civilization is far older and far more persistent than we realized. We're remembering that people have been building cities, organizing societies, accumulating knowledge, and then losing it all for a very, very long time. We're remembering that the story of humanity is not a simple tale of progress but a complex epic of recurring ambition and recurring failure, of knowledge gained at great cost and then squandered or forgotten, of the stubborn human insistence on building, on creating order, on leaving a mark, even in environments hostile to permanence. The rainforests are hostile to permanence. They are engines of decomposition, vast chemical factories breaking down everything into its constituent nutrients and recycling them back into new life. Wood rots, stone erodes, even metal corrodes and crumbles given enough time and humidity. The jungle reclaims everything. It's patient and relentless and ultimately victorious over every human effort to carve out lasting space. And yet people built cities there anyway, massive cities, cities that endured for centuries and in some cases for millennia, cities whose populations rivaled those of contemporary civilizations in more forgiving environments. Why? What drove them to undertake such challenges? Perhaps they had no choice. Perhaps the regions that became rainforests were once more hospitable, were desirable places to live, and when the climate changed and the forests advanced, the people adapted rather than abandoning their homes. Or perhaps there was something in those places, some quality that made them worth the struggle, that justified the constant labor required to maintain urban life in the face of the jungle's assault. Resources, perhaps, valuable plants, minerals, access to trade routes, or sacred significance, places that had been important to their ancestors, places where the gods were near, places that could not be abandoned without abandoning identity itself. We don't know their reasons. We can only observe the results. Cities in the jungle, impossible cities, cities that should not exist according to the logic of environmental determinism, according to the assumption that humans will always choose the easiest path, the most efficient solution. But humans are not purely logical creatures. We're motivated by more than efficiency. We're motivated by meaning, by continuity, by the need to connect with those who came before and those who will come after. We build not just to shelter ourselves but to make statements, to create monuments, to leave something that will outlast our individual lives. And sometimes we build in difficult places precisely because they're difficult, because the challenge itself becomes part of the meaning, because overcoming the obstacles proves something about who we are or who we aspire to be. The jungle cities are acts of defiance. They're humanity declaring that we will live where we choose, that we will impose our patterns on the landscape regardless of what nature prefers, that we will create order even where chaos seems to rule. And for a time, this defiance succeeds. The cities stand. The populations thrive. The knowledge accumulates. But eventually, inevitably, the forest wins. The cities fall silent. The knowledge is lost. The patterns are buried. And the cycle begins again, perhaps in the same location, perhaps elsewhere, as new people rise and build and accumulate knowledge and eventually fall in their turn. This is the pattern revealed by the LiDAR scans, by the excavations, by the dates that keep pushing back earlier and earlier. This is the story the jungle cities tell. Humanity is not on a trajectory but on a wheel, cycling through phases of complexity and simplicity, of knowledge and ignorance, of building and abandonment. And each time we reach the building phase, we think we're doing something new, something unprecedented, unaware that we're following a script that has been performed countless times before, on stages that are now buried beneath our feet. Does this mean our own civilization is doomed to fail, to be forgotten, to be buried like the jungle cities? Perhaps. Probably. Nothing lasts forever. Entropy is the most fundamental law of the universe. But the jungle cities also teach us that failure is not the end. Cities fall, but people survive. Knowledge is lost, but it can be rediscovered. Civilizations collapse, but new ones rise from the ruins. The cycle continues. Humanity persists. We're still here, still building, still accumulating knowledge, still defying the forces that would reduce us to scattered survivors living at the mercy of nature. And perhaps that persistence is the real achievement, not any individual civilization's monuments or technologies, but the species-wide determination to keep trying, to keep building, to keep pushing against the limits, regardless of how many times we've failed before. Look at the LiDAR images again. Look at the patterns revealed beneath the jungle canopy. See the grid of streets, the rectangles of building foundations, the curves of canals and reservoirs. See the regularity, the intention, the intelligence. See the evidence of people who lived and worked and planned and built, people who thought their city would endure, who made decisions with the future in mind, who invested labor and knowledge and hope in structures they believed would outlast them. They were wrong about the permanence, but they were right about the importance of trying. Their cities fell, but the act of building them, the knowledge required to build them, the social organization they represented, these things mattered. These things contributed to the long arc of human development, to the accumulation of experience and wisdom that continues even when individual cultures disappear. There's a concept in ecology called succession. When a piece of land is disturbed by fire, by flood, by human clearing, it doesn't remain bare. Life returns, following a predictable sequence. First come the pioneer species, fast-growing plants that can tolerate harsh conditions. Then come the intermediate species, more diverse, more competitive. Finally, if enough time passes without further disturbance, the climax community establishes itself, the mature ecosystem that represents the stable end state for that environment in that climate. In a tropical environment, the climax community is rainforest. What we're learning from the jungle cities is that this ecological succession operates on top of cultural succession. When a city is abandoned, the forest returns, following its predictable pattern. But underneath, the cultural layers persist. The foundations remain. The modifications to the landscape endure. And when people eventually return to the area, they don't start from scratch. They build on what came before, sometimes literally, constructing new structures on top of old foundations, and sometimes conceptually, rediscovering or remembering the knowledge that allowed cities to exist there in the first place. This creates a kind of resonance between past and present, a continuity that persists even through periods of abandonment and forgetting. The landscape remembers even when the people don't. The patterns in the earth, the changes to hydrology, the concentrations of soil nutrients in old agricultural zones, these all influence what happens when people return, shaping their decisions about where to build and how to organize their settlements even if they're not consciously aware of the earlier occupation. Some researchers have suggested that this is why certain locations seem to repeatedly become important centers of human activity. There are places in the world, river confluences, natural harbors, strategic mountain passes, that have been sites of cities for thousands of years, with each successive civilization building on the same spot, often unaware of the full depth of history beneath them. The location has inherent advantages, geographic features that make it valuable, and every culture that arrives there eventually recognizes those advantages and makes the same choice to build there. But there's also the accumulated human modification of the landscape, the improvements made by earlier inhabitants that make the site even more attractive, even if those improvements are no longer visible on the surface. The jungle cities add another dimension to this phenomenon. They show us that even in environments where decay is rapid, where the forest erases human traces with extraordinary speed, the deep patterns persist. A canal filled with soil is still a depression that will channel water during heavy rains. A terrace overgrown with jungle is still a level area more suitable for building or planting than the surrounding slopes. A reservoir, even if breached and drained centuries ago, is still a low spot where water naturally collects. Future inhabitants will notice these features, will utilize them, will be influenced by them, creating a thread of continuity that connects past and present even across gaps of centuries where no written records exist. This is how knowledge survives loss. Not just through books and teachers, not just through institutional memory and formal education, but through the landscape itself, through the modifications our ancestors made that continue to shape our choices long after the reasons for those modifications have been forgotten. The jungle cities are examples of this embedded knowledge that has been written into the earth itself, waiting to be read by those who know how to look. And we're learning to look. The LiDAR technology is revolutionary not because it reveals anything that wasn't there before. The cities were always there, always real, always exerting their subtle influence on the landscape, but because it allows us to see them, to recognize them, to understand what we're looking at when we stand in the jungle and feel the ground beneath our feet. It translates the hidden patterns into images we can comprehend, into maps and data that our brains, adapted for reading social cues and visible threats, can process and analyze. In this sense, LiDAR is extending our perception, giving us new senses that allow us to understand the world in ways that weren't possible before. And with that extended perception comes new responsibility. Now that we can see the jungle cities, now that we know they exist, we have to decide what that knowledge means, what we should do with. Do we excavate them, exposing them fully to study but also to further decay? Do we leave them buried, protected by the forest that has preserved them for centuries? Do we use them to challenge our historical narratives, forcing textbooks to be rewritten? Or do we treat them as anomalies, exceptions that don't require us to rethink our fundamental assumptions? These are not easy questions. They involve trade-offs between knowledge and preservation, between the desire to understand the past and the recognition that our understanding always comes at some cost to what we're studying. The act of archaeology is inherently destructive. You cannot excavate a site without changing it, without removing the context that made it meaningful. Every artifact extracted is an artifact displaced. Every structure exposed to air and light begins to deteriorate in new ways. The jungle, for all that it obscures and conceals, also protects. The soil and the roots and the constant humidity maintain the structures in a kind of stasis, unchanged precisely because they're isolated from human contact. Once we intervene, once we begin to study them, that stasis ends. And yet we cannot simply leave them alone. The knowledge they contain is too important. The questions they raise are too fundamental. The challenge they pose to our understanding of human history is too significant to ignore. We have to find a balance, a way to learn from the jungle cities without destroying them, a way to incorporate their lessons into our historical narratives without distorting or oversimplifying what they represent. This requires careful work, methodical excavation, extensive documentation, collaboration between researchers from multiple disciplines, archaeology, environmental science, linguistics, genetics, climatology, all working together to build a picture of these lost civilizations that is as complete and accurate as possible. It also requires humility. The jungle cities are teaching us that we don't know as much as we thought we did. They're revealing the gaps in our knowledge, the assumptions we've made that turn out to be wrong, the confidence we've had in our historical models that was premature. This is uncomfortable. It challenges professional reputations built on those models. It requires established researchers to acknowledge that their work may need revision, that conclusions they've taught for decades may no longer be tenable in light of new evidence. But this is how science advances. Not through the defense of existing ideas, but through their continuous testing, refinement, and when necessary, replacement with better ideas that explain the evidence more completely. The jungle cities are forcing this kind of advancement. They're pushing archaeology toward new methods, new questions, new ways of thinking about the past. They're encouraging collaboration between disciplines that have traditionally worked in isolation. They're demonstrating the value of technologies like LiDAR that can reveal what traditional survey methods miss. They're reminding us that the Earth still holds secrets, that we haven't discovered everything, that no matter how much we think we know about human history, there's always more to learn. And what we're learning is that human beings have been far more capable, far more ambitious, far more widespread in our accomplishments than the traditional narratives suggest. The jungle cities are not primitive settlements. They're sophisticated urban centers built by people who understood engineering, astronomy, agriculture, and social organization at levels comparable to any ancient civilization. The fact that they're in rainforests, in environments we consider challenging, doesn't diminish this sophistication. If anything, it increases it. Building a city in the jungle requires not just knowledge but determination, not just engineering but persistence, not just labor but vision. The people who built these cities saw beyond the immediate challenges to the possibilities, to the life that could be created there, to the cultures that could flourish if they could just solve the problems of water management and food production and disease control. They solved those problems. The cities stood before they were abandoned, as proof that the problems were solvable, that humans can thrive even in difficult environments if we apply our intelligence and our labor. And then they abandoned the cities anyway, not because they couldn't solve the technical challenges but because those challenges became unsustainable over long periods, or because other factors, climate change, warfare, social upheaval, made the cities untenable despite their technical sophistication. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson of the jungle cities. That sophistication is not enough, that knowledge is not enough, that even when we solve the immediate problems and build cities that work and sustain large populations, we're still vulnerable to forces beyond our control, or to the long-term consequences of our own actions. The cities failed. The knowledge was lost. The populations dispersed or died. And the forest returned, indifferent to human ambition, reclaiming the space that had been taken from it, burying the monuments and the homes and the temples until only the patterns remained, invisible beneath the green. But humanity didn't fail. We're still here. The cities fell, but people survived. The knowledge was lost in one place and rediscovered in another. The cycle continued. And this continuity, this persistence across countless setbacks and collapses, is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the human story. We don't give up. We don't accept defeat. When one civilization falls, we build another. When one city is abandoned, we build elsewhere. When knowledge is lost, we rediscover it or reinvent it. The wheel turns. The cycle repeats. And through it all, through all the failures and recoveries, we accumulate experience, we refine our understanding, we get a little bit better at the long-term project of being human. The jungle cities are waypoints in this project, markers of attempts that succeeded for a time and then failed, but which contributed to the overall journey. The people who built them were not so different from us. They faced challenges. They applied knowledge and labor to overcome those challenges. They created societies that worked for generations or centuries. And then those societies ended, for reasons that were probably complex and multifactorial, reasons that involved both external pressures and internal weaknesses, reasons that their descendants may have understood or may have mythologized or may have forgotten entirely. We're in a similar position now. We've built our own global civilization, one that depends on complex systems and accumulated knowledge and international cooperation. We face our own challenges: climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, the question of how to maintain stability and progress in an increasingly interconnected world. We have more knowledge than any previous civilization, more technology, more capability to shape our environment. But the jungle cities remind us that knowledge and capability are not guarantees. They remind us that civilizations can fail despite their sophistication, that cities can be abandoned despite their size and complexity, that the long term is longer than we usually think about, and that the forces that brought down previous civilizations, climate, conflict, the inability to adapt quickly enough to changing conditions, are still operative, still dangerous, still capable of overwhelming even the most advanced societies. So what should we do with this knowledge? How should we respond to the lessons of the jungle cities? We could despair, could see them as evidence that all human effort is ultimately futile, that everything we build will eventually fall and be forgotten. But that's not the only interpretation, and it's probably not the most useful one. The jungle cities also show us that building is worthwhile even if what we build doesn't last forever, that the act of creating civilization, of organizing society, of accumulating knowledge, of constructing monuments and infrastructure, has value in itself, regardless of whether it endures for centuries or millennia or only decades. The people who built the jungle cities lived lives that were probably more comfortable, more meaningful, more culturally rich than they would have been if their ancestors had remained scattered hunter-gatherers. The cities allowed for specialization, for art and astronomy and philosophy, for all the elaborations of culture that are only possible when people have surplus time and resources. The fact that those cities eventually fell doesn't negate the value of the lives lived within them. Those people mattered. Their experiences were real. Their knowledge, though much of it is lost to us, was real. Their contribution to the long arc of human development was real, even if we can't trace the specific connections, even if their influence comes down to us only as echoes and fragments and patterns in the earth. This perspective, that the journey matters as much as the destination, that the act of building and learning and living in civilization is valuable in itself, is perhaps the most important lesson the jungle cities offer. They tell us not to be paralyzed by the fear of eventual failure, not to refrain from building because what we build might not last. They tell us to build anyway, to organize our societies, to accumulate knowledge, to create beauty and meaning and comfort for ourselves and our descendants. They tell us that this is what humans do, what we've always done, and that each iteration, each attempt at civilization, contributes something to the species-wide project even if the individual attempt fails. They also tell us to be humble, to recognize that our current civilization, for all its achievements, is not the final word, not the permanent culmination of human development. We are part of a longer story, one that includes countless attempts that came before us and will include countless attempts that come after us. We should build as if our work will last forever, but we should plan knowing that it probably won't, that future generations will face their own challenges, that they'll have to adapt or rebuild or sometimes abandon what we've created. Our responsibility is not to create something permanent that may be impossible, but to create something worthwhile, something that serves the present and near future well, and to pass on whatever knowledge and wisdom we accumulate to those who come after, knowing that they'll use it in ways we can't predict, in contexts we can't imagine. The jungle cities are passing on knowledge to us right now. They're teaching us about hydraulic engineering, about sustainable agriculture in tropical environments, about urban planning at large scales. Modern researchers are studying the canal systems, the terrace designs, the water management strategies, looking for insights that might be applicable to current challenges. Some of the techniques being rediscovered in these ancient cities, methods for improving soil fertility, for managing water in areas prone to both drought and flooding, for building structures that can withstand tropical conditions, are being considered for use in modern development projects. The ancient knowledge, preserved in the landscape, is being reactivated, translated into contemporary practice. This is the cycle at work. Knowledge accumulated, lost, preserved in physical form, rediscovered, and reapplied. It's not a closed loop. Each iteration adds something new, refines the understanding, adapts the knowledge to new contexts. The people who are studying the jungle cities now have tools and perspectives that the original builders didn't have. We can analyze the chemistry of the soils, can model water flow through canal systems, can use satellites to understand the broader landscape context. We're adding our layer to the accumulated knowledge, contributing to a tradition that spans millennia and will continue beyond us. And someday, perhaps, our cities will be jungle cities. If current climate trends continue, if the rainforests expand their range as temperatures and rainfall patterns shift, the urban centers we're building now might find themselves in the same position as the ancient Maya or Khmer or Amazonian cities. Gradually overwhelmed by vegetation, slowly buried, their inhabitants forced to adapt or migrate. Future archaeologists, using technologies we can't yet imagine, will send their sensors through the canopy and discover our geometry, our streets and buildings and infrastructure, and they'll wonder about us the same way we wonder about the people who built the cities we're now discovering. They'll date our structures, excavate our artifacts, try to understand our culture and our knowledge from the fragments that survive. They'll construct narratives about us, narratives that will be partly right and partly wrong, that will emphasize certain aspects of our civilization while missing others entirely. This is not a morbid thought. It's a realistic one. It's a recognition that we are part of the long flow of human history, not separate from it, not exempt from the cycles that have affected every civilization before us. And in recognizing this, in accepting our place in the longer story, we might make better decisions, might think more carefully about what we're building and how we're building it, might consider not just the next quarter or the next election but the next century or the next millennium. The jungle cities ask us to think on long timescales, to consider the deep past and the distant future, to recognize that human civilization is both incredibly fragile and remarkably persistent. They ask us to hold two seemingly contradictory ideas in our minds simultaneously, that what we build will eventually fall, and that building is nonetheless worthwhile. They ask us to be both ambitious and humble, to create as if our works will last forever while acknowledging that nothing lasts forever, to accumulate knowledge while recognizing that knowledge can be lost, to plan for the future while accepting that the future is fundamentally uncertain. These are not comfortable thoughts. Modern culture, particularly in the developed world, tends toward optimism, toward belief in progress, toward the assumption that things will generally get better, that each generation will live more comfortably than the last, that knowledge accumulates irreversibly, that we've moved past the cycles of rise and fall that characterized earlier eras. The jungle cities challenge this optimism. They show us that progress is not guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost, that civilizations do fall, that the arc of history doesn't inevitably bend toward greater complexity and capability. But they don't counsel despair. They counsel wisdom. They suggest that we should enjoy and utilize what we've built while we have it, should value the knowledge and capabilities our civilization has accumulated, should work to preserve and pass on what's worth preserving, but should also be prepared for change, for adaptation, for the possibility that the systems we depend on might not endure indefinitely. They suggest that we should build with an eye toward resilience rather than just efficiency, toward sustainability rather than just growth, toward adaptability rather than just optimization for current conditions. These principles, resilience, sustainability, adaptability, are increasingly recognized as important by modern planners and policymakers, but they're often in tension with the economic and political pressures that drive most decision-making. The jungle cities give us historical examples of what happens when those tensions are resolved in favor of short-term optimization at the expense of long-term resilience. The cities grew large and prosperous, developing increasingly complex systems to support their populations. But those complex systems, optimized for specific conditions, proved brittle when conditions changed. When droughts came, when rainfall patterns shifted, when the soil was depleted, when diseases spread, the systems couldn't adapt quickly enough. The complexity that had been a strength became a vulnerability. The specialization that had allowed for cultural flourishing meant that people couldn't easily return to simpler, more self-sufficient lifestyles when the urban systems began to fail. This is a lesson worth remembering. Complexity is not always strength. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is also the most fragile. Sometimes the ability to do things simply, the maintenance of redundancy and diversity, the preservation of skills and knowledge that aren't currently being used but might be needed in changed circumstances. Sometimes these things are more valuable than efficiency or optimization. The jungle cities fell, in part, because they were optimized for conditions that didn't last. Our own civilization is highly optimized for current conditions, for cheap energy, for stable climate, for international trade networks, for digital communications. What happens if those conditions change? Are we resilient, or are we brittle? The LiDAR scans show us the geometry of the jungle cities, but they don't show us the human stories, the decisions made and paths not taken, the debates and compromises and gradual accumulation of choices that led to the city's eventual forms and eventual fates. Those stories are lost. We can infer them, can make educated guesses based on archaeological evidence and comparative studies of other civilizations, but we can't know them with certainty. What we can know is the outcome. Cities that thrived and then failed, knowledge that was gained and then lost, populations that grew and then dispersed or collapsed. And knowing this outcome, we can ask ourselves, what would we do differently? If we could go back and advise the builders of those jungle cities, knowing what we know about how their story ended, what would we tell them? Would we tell them not to build in the jungle at all, to choose easier environments? But then they wouldn't have built anything, wouldn't have created the cultures and knowledge we're now recovering. Would we tell them to build smaller, simpler cities that might have been more resilient but also less impressive, less capable of supporting the populations and cultural elaborations that make civilizations worth studying? Would we tell them to prioritize sustainability over growth, even if that meant limiting their achievements in their own time? These are questions without easy answers, because they involve trade-offs between competing values. The same question faces us now. Should we limit our own civilization's complexity and ambition in the interest of long-term sustainability and resilience? Or should we push forward, accumulating as much knowledge and capability as possible while we can, accepting that our current systems might not endure indefinitely but that they're producing tremendous value in the present? Should we optimize for the long term or the short term, for average outcomes or peak achievements, for the survival of the civilization or the flourishing of individuals within it? The jungle cities don't answer these questions for us. They just remind us that the questions are real, that they have consequences, that the choices we make now will affect not just our own lives but the lives of people who come after us, people who might live in the ruins of what we're building, trying to understand what we were thinking, what we valued, why we made the choices we made. There's something deeply human about the impulse to build in difficult places, to take on challenges that are not strictly necessary. We could have stayed in the savannas and grasslands where our species evolved, in the environments where our biology is best adapted. Instead, we spread across the entire planet, into deserts and tundra and high mountains and dense forests, adapting each environment to our needs, developing technologies and techniques to survive and eventually thrive in places that should, by rights, be inhospitable to a species of tropical apes. The jungle cities are examples of this impulse taken to an extreme. Not just surviving in the rainforest but building urban civilizations there, creating complexity and culture in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Why do we do this? Why do we push boundaries, seek out challenges, build in places where building is difficult? Part of it is surely necessity. As populations grow, people spread into less desirable areas because the most desirable ones are already occupied. But there's more to it than that. There's something in human nature that's drawn to difficulty, that finds meaning in overcoming obstacles, that wants to prove that we can do what seems impossible. The jungle cities were declarations of this spirit, statements that humans could build anywhere, could create order anywhere, could impose our vision on even the most resistant landscapes. And for a time, we succeeded. The cities stood. The knowledge accumulated. The populations thrived. But nature is patient, and in the long run, the jungle won. The cities fell. The forest returned. The declaration of human dominance was answered by the forest's quiet insistence. This is my domain, and I will reclaim it, always, eventually. The jungle cities are monuments both to human ambition and to human hubris, to our capacity to achieve remarkable things and to our ultimate powerlessness in the face of forces larger than ourselves. This dual lesson, that we are both powerful and powerless, both capable of great achievements and subject to forces beyond our control, is perhaps the most important thing the jungle cities can teach us. It's a lesson in perspective, in understanding our place in the larger scheme of things. We are not gods. We cannot control everything. But we are not helpless either. We can build. We can learn. We can adapt. We can create remarkable things even in difficult circumstances. The question is not whether we can achieve great things, the jungle cities prove that we can, but whether we can sustain them, whether we can maintain the knowledge and systems and social cohesion necessary to keep our civilizations running over the very long term. History suggests that we cannot, or at least that we haven't been able to so far. Every civilization eventually falls. Every city eventually decays. Every system eventually breaks down. But history also suggests that this is not the end of the story, that from the ruins of one civilization come the seeds of the next, that knowledge lost in one place is rediscovered in another, that humanity as a whole keeps moving forward even if individual societies move backward. The jungle cities fell, but people survived. They built new cities elsewhere, or returned to simpler ways of living, or adapted to changed circumstances. The species persisted. The long project continued. And now we're at another point in that long project, equipped with more knowledge than any previous generation, facing challenges that are in some ways unique to our time, global climate change, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, but which are in other ways very similar to the challenges that faced the builders of the jungle cities. How to manage resources sustainably, how to maintain social cohesion, how to adapt to changing conditions, how to pass on knowledge to future generations. The specific details are different, but the underlying questions are the same. The jungle cities didn't answer those questions successfully in the long term. Can we? Perhaps. Or perhaps we'll follow the same pattern. Rise, flourish, accumulate knowledge and complexity, and eventually fail, leaving behind our own ruins for future archaeologists to discover and puzzle over. The honest answer is that we don't know. We can't know. The future is not determined. The choices we make matter. The systems we build, the knowledge we preserve, the values we pass on, all of these things will influence what comes next, even if they don't determine it entirely. What we can do is learn from the past, learn from the jungle cities and all the other civilizations that have risen and fallen before us. We can study their successes and their failures, their innovations and their mistakes. We can try to understand what made them resilient and what made them vulnerable. We can apply those lessons to our own situation, recognizing that our context is different but that human nature and certain fundamental challenges, resource management, social organization, adaptation to environmental change, remain constant across time and cultures. The jungle cities are laboratories for understanding these challenges. They're natural experiments that ran their course centuries ago, producing results we can now examine and analyze. They show us what happens when civilizations optimize for growth without adequate attention to sustainability. They show us the consequences of environmental changes that societies can't adapt to quickly enough. They show us that knowledge can be lost if it's not preserved and transmitted effectively. They show us that even impressive achievements and sophisticated technologies don't guarantee long-term survival. But they also show us that building is worthwhile, that the attempt to create civilization is valuable even if the civilization doesn't last forever, that human ingenuity and determination can overcome tremendous obstacles, that we are capable of far more than survival, that we can create beauty and meaning and complexity even in the most challenging environments. The jungle cities were achievements. They were worthy endeavors. The people who built them lived lives that mattered, that contributed to the long human story, even though their specific civilizations eventually fell. Consider one final image as we approach the end of this long night's journey through the forgotten cities. Imagine a Maya scribe in the final years of one of the great Petan cities, during the collapse period of the 9th century. The city is emptying. People are leaving, moving to smaller settlements in the hills, abandoning the urban core that has been home to their families for generations. The causes are multiple and interconnected. The rains have been unreliable for years. The reservoirs are lower than they've ever been. The agricultural terraces that once fed tens of thousands now support far fewer. Social tensions are rising, trade networks are breaking down, conflicts with neighboring cities have become more frequent and more desperate. The scribe knows this is the end, or at least an ending. The city might recover, it has weathered crises before, but something feels different this time, more final. The scribe is one of the last educated people remaining, one of the few who can read and write the complex glyphs that record the city's history, its astronomical observations, its ritual calendar, its connections to the gods and the cosmos. The scribe is working on one last text, inscribing it carefully on a stone monument or perhaps on bark paper that will be stored in the temple, knowing that there may not be anyone left to read it, that the knowledge being recorded might be lost, that future generations might not even remember that this city existed. What does the scribe write? A chronicle of events, perhaps, trying to explain to the future what happened, why the city fell. A plea to the gods, asking for relief, for rain, for a return to the prosperous times that now seem impossibly distant. Instructions for maintaining the knowledge, for preserving the astronomical observations and mathematical calculations, for keeping alive the traditions that have sustained the culture for centuries. Or maybe just a simple statement. We were here, we built this, we knew things, remember us. We don't know what that final scribe wrote, because most of the texts didn't survive. The bark paper deteriorated in the humid jungle air. The stone monuments were toppled and buried. The knowledge was lost. But we can imagine that final act of writing, that attempt to send a message across time to an uncertain future, and we can recognize it as something deeply human, something we still do. Every time we record knowledge, every time we create a monument or write a book or encode information in digital storage, we're doing what that Maya scribe was doing. We're trying to preserve something beyond our own lives, to communicate with the future, to ensure that what we've learned and built and accomplished isn't lost completely. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the message gets through. Archaeologists found enough Maya texts to begin deciphering the script, to start understanding the culture and history and knowledge of that civilization. The LiDAR found the cities beneath the jungle, revealed their extent and complexity, allowed us to begin appreciating what was built and what was lost. Our modern technology is, in a sense, receiving the message that ancient scribe tried to send, answering the plea to be remembered. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes the message is lost. Sometimes civilizations disappear so completely that we don't even know they existed. The oldest layers beneath the jungle cities, the ones that predate the Maya and the Khmer and the Amazonian cultures we've given names to, those layers represent civilizations that might have been equally sophisticated, equally deserving of remembrance, but which left too few traces for us to understand them. They built, They accumulated knowledge, they tried to preserve their achievements, but time and decay and the overwhelming force of the jungle erased almost everything. They're there in the deep stratigraphy, in the dates that don't fit our models, in the engineering that seems too advanced for its supposed age, but we can't tell their stories because their stories are lost. This is the tragedy of the jungle cities and of human civilization more broadly. That so much is lost, that so much knowledge and achievement and human experience vanishes without trace, that the vast majority of human lives leave no record, that even the most impressive civilizations can be forgotten. But it's not a simple tragedy, because alongside the loss there's also the persistence, the continuation, the fact that even when knowledge is lost in one place it can be rediscovered in another, that even when cities fall new ones rise, that humanity as a whole keeps the project going even when individual efforts fail. The jungle cities are part of this larger pattern. They represent attempts that succeeded for a time and then failed, but which contributed to the ongoing human story. The knowledge accumulated in those cities, even when it was lost locally, influenced the cultures that came after, either directly through some chain of transmission we don't fully understand, or indirectly through the modifications to the landscape, through the selection pressures that shaped how people adapted to jungle environments, through the accumulated experience that gets encoded not in texts but in cultural practices and biological adaptations. We are the heirs of all those ancient attempts, including the ones we don't know about, including the jungle cities that are still hidden beneath canopies we haven't scanned yet, including the civilizations that were drowned by rising seas or buried by other catastrophes. Everything that came before contributed something to what we are now, even if we can't trace the specific connections, even if the inheritance is so diluted and transformed that it's unrecognizable. We stand on layers and layers of accumulated human experience, most of it forgotten, all of it contributing to the foundation that makes our current civilization possible. And what will we contribute to the layers that come after us? What traces will we leave for the archaeologists of the distant future, assuming there are archaeologists in the distant future, assuming humanity survives long enough for there to be a distant future? Our cities are built of materials that will last longer than the wood and earthworks of the jungle cities. Steel and concrete will persist for centuries or millennia, though they'll eventually decay. Our knowledge is recorded in more media than any previous civilization: books, digital storage, physical monuments, the very structure of our global infrastructure. Surely something will survive. Surely future generations will be able to understand what we built and what we knew. But the jungle cities suggest caution. They were built to last too. They used stone, they created monuments, they encoded knowledge in durable forms. And yet most of it is lost. Most of what they knew, most of what they achieved, most of their stories and thoughts and daily lives. All of it gone, leaving only fragments, only patterns in the earth, only mysteries for us to puzzle over. Will our digital storage be readable in 1,000 years? In 10,000 years? Will future people be able to decode our languages, understand our symbols, reconstruct our knowledge from the ruins we leave behind? Or will they look at our works the way we look at the jungle cities, with wonder at the scale and sophistication, but with frustration at how much is missing, how much can't be recovered? These questions are not just philosophical. They have practical implications. If we want our knowledge to survive, if we want future generations to benefit from what we've learned, we need to think carefully about how we preserve it. Digital storage is efficient and compact, but it's also fragile and dependent on specific technologies. How do you read a hard drive if you don't have the right computer, the right software, the right understanding of the encoding? How do you even know what a hard drive is if your civilization doesn't have electricity? Stone monuments are less efficient but more durable. They can be read thousands of years later if the language is preserved or can be deciphered. But how do you encode complex knowledge in stone? How do you fit libraries' worth of information into monuments? There's no perfect solution. Every preservation method has trade-offs. The best approach is probably redundancy. Preserve knowledge in multiple ways using multiple media spread across multiple locations, so that even if some methods fail or some locations are destroyed, copies survive elsewhere. This is what libraries and museums do, what digital backup systems do, what scientific publication does. It's an ancient strategy, really. The Maya didn't put all their knowledge in one temple. They distributed it across multiple cities, recorded it in multiple forms. When some cities fell, others survived, keeping the knowledge alive until the final collapse overwhelmed them all. We should do better. We have the technology and the global reach to preserve knowledge more redundantly than any previous civilization. We can store information physically and digitally, locally and remotely, in surface repositories and in deep-time archives designed to be readable thousands of years in the future. We can create knowledge preservation systems that are resilient to individual failures, to local catastrophes, even to global disruptions. Whether we will actually do this, whether we'll invest the resources and maintain the commitment necessary to preserve knowledge for the very long term, is another question. It's not as urgent as other demands. It doesn't have obvious short-term benefits. It requires thinking on timescales that humans are not naturally comfortable with. But the jungle cities show us what happens when knowledge isn't preserved, when civilizations fall and their achievements are forgotten. They show us that the default is loss, that without active effort to preserve and transmit knowledge, it disappears, sometimes so completely that future generations don't even know it existed. If we care about the future, if we care about the continuity of human civilization and knowledge across deep time, we need to take preservation seriously. We need to build our own monuments, not just physical ones but institutional and cultural ones, systems and traditions that are designed to outlast individual lifetimes or even individual civilizations. This is part of what it means to be a civilization rather than just a collection of individuals. A civilization is an intergenerational project, a contract between past, present, and future. We inherit knowledge and infrastructure from previous generations. We use it, add to it, maintain it, and we have a responsibility to pass it on, improved if possible but at minimum preserved, to those who come after us. The jungle cities represent failed intergenerational contracts, places where the chain was broken, where knowledge was not successfully transmitted, where the connection between past and future was severed. The causes were complex: environmental change, social upheaval, the sheer difficulty of maintaining complexity over long periods. But the result was the same. Discontinuity, loss, the need for future generations to rediscover or reinvent what had been known before. We're trying not to repeat that pattern. Modern civilization is explicitly designed for continuity, with institutions like universities and libraries and scientific journals intended to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. We have global communication networks that spread knowledge so widely that local disruptions can't destroy it entirely. We have historical consciousness, an awareness of the past, and a desire to learn from it that might help us avoid some of the mistakes that brought down previous civilizations. But we also have vulnerabilities that the jungle cities didn't have. We're more interconnected, which means disruptions can spread globally rather than remaining localized. We're more dependent on complex technologies, which means we're more vulnerable to cascading failures if key systems break down. We're affecting the global environment in ways that are unprecedented in human history, potentially triggering changes that we won't be able to adapt to quickly enough. The jungle cities fell partly because they couldn't adapt to climate change fast enough. We're currently causing climate change on a much larger scale. What makes us think we'll do better? Perhaps nothing makes us think we'll do better. Perhaps the honest assessment is that we probably won't, that our civilization will eventually join the jungle cities and all the other lost civilizations in the archaeological record, that future people will use their advanced scanning technologies to peer beneath whatever has overgrown our cities and will wonder about us the same way we wonder about the Maya and the Khmer. Perhaps the cycle will continue, as it apparently has for thousands or tens of thousands of years, with each iteration of human civilization rising, achieving remarkable things, and then falling, contributing its accumulated knowledge to the great collective project even as its specific achievements are lost or forgotten. If that's the case, if failure is inevitable, if all civilizations eventually fall, what should we do? Should we despair, give up, stop trying to build or preserve or improve? That seems like the wrong response. The jungle cities didn't fail because their builders were foolish or wrong to build. They failed because maintaining complexity over very long periods in challenging environments is difficult, perhaps impossible, but the attempt was still worthwhile. The centuries or millennia during which those cities thrived were valuable. The knowledge accumulated was real. The lives lived there were meaningful. The fact that it ended doesn't negate the value of what came before. The same will be true of our civilization. Even if it eventually fails, even if future archaeologists study our ruins and puzzle over our mistakes, the present still matters. The lives we're living now still have value. The knowledge we're accumulating still contributes to the long human project. The things we're building, physical infrastructure, social systems, scientific understanding, artistic and cultural achievements, all of these things are worthwhile even if they don't last forever. We should build as if they will last, should try to create systems that are sustainable and resilient, should work to preserve knowledge for the long term. But we should also recognize that the act of building, the process of civilization itself, has value independent of how long the specific results endure. This is perhaps the final lesson of the jungle cities, that the value is in the attempt, in the ongoing project of human civilization, in the accumulated experience and knowledge that passes from one generation to the next even when specific institutions or societies fail. The jungle cities are part of that project. They contributed knowledge about urban planning in tropical environments, about hydraulic engineering, about agriculture and astronomy and social organization. Much of that knowledge was lost when the cities fell, but not all of it. Some survived in the landscape itself, in the modifications that influenced what came after. Some survived through distant connections and influences we don't fully understand. Some survived by being independently rediscovered, proving that the knowledge was valid, that the solutions found by ancient engineers were real solutions that would be found again by anyone tackling the same problems. And now some of that knowledge is surviving through modern archaeology, through our ability to scan and excavate and analyze the ruins, to reconstruct what was built and how, to learn from the successes and failures of these ancient civilizations. The knowledge is being recovered, reactivated, made available to address current challenges. The cycle is continuing, but with each turn we potentially accumulate more, preserve more, understand more. Perhaps that's the best we can hope for. Not permanent success, not an end to the cycle of rise and fall, but gradual improvement in how much we retain between cycles, in how much knowledge survives to seed the next attempt. The jungle cities are asking us to think about our place in this long cycle, to recognize that we're not separate from it, not exempt from the patterns that have shaped human history for millennia. They're asking us to be both ambitious and humble, to build remarkably while accepting impermanence, to accumulate knowledge while working to preserve it, to enjoy what we've created while preparing for the possibility that it won't last forever. They're asking us to take the long view, to think not just about next year or next decade but about next century and next millennium, about what we want to pass on and what we want to be remembered for. If you're still listening, if you've stayed with me through this long exploration of the forgotten jungle cities, then you've demonstrated something important. The willingness to think about deep time, to consider the long arc of human history, to sit with uncomfortable questions about civilization and permanence and loss. This is exactly the kind of thinking the jungle cities invite. They can't be understood in sound bites or simple narratives. They require patience, reflection, the willingness to hold complexity and contradiction, to accept that some questions don't have simple answers. The cities are still there, beneath the jungle canopy, waiting for more LiDAR scans, more excavations, more careful study. Each year we learn more about them, and each year they raise new questions. They're a reminder that history is not finished, that our understanding of the past is constantly evolving, that there's always more to discover. They're also a reminder that the past is not really past, that it shapes the present in countless ways, that we are building on foundations laid by people we'll never know, in times we can barely imagine, working toward futures we can't predict. Look at the images one more time if you can. Look at the LiDAR scans showing city grids beneath the forest. Look at the patterns in the earth that mark where people once lived and built and dreamed. See the geometry, the intention, the intelligence. And recognize that you're looking at family, at ancestors, at people who were fundamentally like you even though their lives were separated from yours by centuries or millennia. They faced challenges. They applied knowledge and labor to overcome them. They built remarkable things. They failed eventually, but they tried, and the trying mattered. We're doing the same thing now. We're building, learning, trying to create something worthwhile, knowing that it might not last forever but believing that the attempt has value. The jungle cities show us that this is the human condition, the pattern that repeats across time and space, the project we're all part of whether we recognize it or not. And in understanding this, in seeing ourselves as part of that long continuity, we might find both wisdom and comfort. wisdom to build more carefully, more sustainably, with greater awareness of our place in the larger story, and comfort in knowing that we're not alone, that countless others have walked this path before us, that the project continues even when individual attempts fail, that humanity persists even when civilizations fall. The jungle keeps its secrets still, but we're learning to read them. The cities are speaking across time, teaching lessons about ambition and hubris, achievement and loss, persistence and impermanence. Listen to what they're saying. Learn from their example. And then go build something worthwhile, knowing that it might not last forever, but that the act of building, the commitment to creating civilization and accumulating knowledge and passing on wisdom to the next generation, that this is what we're here to do, what we've always done, what defines us as human. The jungle cities did it. We're doing it now. Others will do it after us. The cycle continues. The project endures. And in that continuity, in that long intergenerational conversation across deep time, there is meaning, purpose, and perhaps even hope. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me in the comments. And if you found value in this journey through the forgotten cities, consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate thinking about the long arc of human history, about the civilizations that rise and fall and rise again, about the lessons written in stone and earth beneath the endless green.